The boardroom froze when the billionaire unfolded a resume written in crayon. Skills, drawing fast, not crying, keeping secrets. It wasn't a joke. It was from a 9-year-old girl named Lila, who'd just walked past security and stood, trembling but unshaken, at the head of the table. She wasn't there for money. She was there because her home was being taken. And with a single sentence, 6 words, she shattered a room built on power and made it weep. What she said next didn't just stop a housing project. It started a movement. The boardroom gleamed like it had something to prove. Polished wood stretched the length of the room, lined with chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, a panorama of power and precision. At the head of the table sat Conrad Vale, billionaire, venture titan, and the kind of man who had forgotten the last time someone interrupted him without permission. Until today. The doors opened mid-sentence. He'd been in the middle of a quarterly report discussing projections and acquisitions when the assistant leaned in, her face flushed. "There's a girl asking for you." "A girl?" "She says she has a meeting." Conrad frowned. "We're in the middle of—" She handed me this. She extended a folded sheet of paper, smudged slightly at the corners. Conrad raised an eyebrow, but took it. The room went quiet as he unfolded it. It was a resume, written in crayon. Name, Lila James, age 9. Skills, drawing fast, not crying in hard times, keeping secrets. Experience, helping mom, learning without help, staying quiet when people are tired. Objective, to make someone remember what it feels like to be little. At the bottom, in large, uneven handwriting, it read, "I need 10 minutes, please." Someone chuckled nervously. "Is this a prank?" murmured a board member. But Conrad said nothing. He rose from his seat. "Send her in." The room shifted uncomfortably as the doors opened wider and a small girl stepped inside. Her shoes were scuffed. Her backpack hung loosely off one shoulder. She walked straight to the head of the table and stood in front of Conrad Vale like the room didn't terrify her. Like she belonged. He crouched slightly. "You're Lila." She nodded. "You read it?" "Yes." She took a deep breath and reached into her backpack. "I brought something." She placed a second piece of paper on the table. This one was a drawing. A tall building, clearly this one, surrounded by smaller houses. In the corner, a stick figure with a ponytail stood between 2 arrows. One pointed to the big building, the other pointed to a house with a red X over it. "That's me," she said. "We lived over there. Then we got a paper in the mail. Mom cried." Conrad said nothing. "I looked it up. Your company bought our block." He blinked. "Which property?" "Roosevelt and 3rd. A project name echoed in his head. R3 Acquisition Redevelopment. It had been a line item on a call last month. Rezoned, approved, cleared for redevelopment. They hadn't mentioned tenants. Lila looked around the room. "I know I'm not supposed to be here, but Mom said if we want people to listen, we have to talk like them." She pointed to the resume. "I thought maybe if I brought one, someone would stop." The air changed. The board sat frozen, unsure whether this was a stunt or a revolution. Conrad knelt in front of her. "Lila, how long have you lived there?" 5 years, since I was 4. I had a dog. He's gone now." He swallowed. "Why did you come here?" "Because Mom won't." "Why not?" "She says you don't cry, that people like you don't." Conrad blinked. "Do you think that's true?" he asked softly. "I hoped it wasn't," she said. "But I needed to see." And then, with her chin raised and her hands shaking, she said the sentence that broke him open in front of every executive in the room. "If I matter, will you cry?" The room didn't breathe. Conrad felt it like a slap. He thought of the signatures he'd given, the contracts, the meetings where people like her were numbers, where losses were buffered under phrases like inevitable displacement and long-term growth. He looked at her, and his eyes burned. A tear slipped down his cheek, then another. And for the first time in a room built on dominance, power, and silence, Conrad Vale wept. He reached out and took her resume, held it carefully. "You matter," he said, then turned to the room, voice shaking. "I want the R3 redevelopment halted, effective immediately." There was a ripple of gasps. "We reevaluate every property. We create a policy. No child loses a home because of us. Not again." A board member stammered. "But the contracts—" "We buy people back in," Conrad snapped. "We don't remove them." He turned to Lila again. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "That's good," she said, "because Mom said tears mean you're still human." He walked her out personally, hand in hand, past stunned assistants and security guards who stepped aside without question. At the door, she turned. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not needing all the words first." She left. Conrad stood alone in the hallway, resume still in hand, feeling like the richest man in the city had just been interviewed by someone who owned nothing but truth, and passed. Conrad didn't go back to the boardroom, not that day, not even the next. Instead, he returned to Roosevelt and Third. No press, no security detail, just himself, dressed down in jeans and a blazer, with Lila's resume folded neatly into the inside pocket of his jacket. It had been creased and handled so many times the crayon was beginning to smudge, but he carried it like something sacred. The neighborhood looked like thousands of others. Row houses squeezed together, aging storefronts with signs in faded paint, people moving slowly through late afternoon sun. But now he saw things he hadn't seen before. The cracks, the sag, in the foundation of what people called home. The quiet acts of resistance in window boxes, in murals painted on alley walls, in chalk hearts drawn on sidewalks. He found the building Lila had drawn, and beneath its windows, her. She sat on the stoop with a book open across her knees, legs swinging slightly. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but she didn't run. "You came back." He nodded. "Is your mom home?" Lila glanced toward the door. "She's resting. She works at night now." "May I sit?" She scooted over without a word. He sat. For a while they said nothing. Then Conrad spoke, his voice quiet. "I didn't know that we were hurting people. Now you do." "I do." She turned to him. "What are you going to do with it?" "With what?" "The knowing." Conrad looked at the street, at the boy riding a bike with a broken pedal, at the couple arguing softly in Spanish 2 doors down, at the old woman dragging a cart full of laundry over uneven sidewalk. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think it starts with asking people what they need, not assuming." Lila nodded like she'd known that already. He looked at her. "You said something that stayed with me," she smirked. "The crying thing?" He laughed. "Yes, that." Lila stood. Grown-ups cry when they want to change. Then she pulled something from her backpack and handed it to him. Another drawing. This one showed a neighborhood like hers, same lines, same uneven bricks. But in the middle was a tree, a big one, green and full, with a swing hanging from one side. Beneath it 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. She pointed. "That's me, and that's you, and the swing means we stayed." Conrad looked at the drawing, throat tightening. "I want to make it true," he said. "Then do it," she said simply. She walked inside, letting the screen door slam behind her. Conrad sat with the drawing in his lap. He stayed until the sun dipped behind the rooftops. The next morning, he returned to headquarters. He stood in front of his board. Same long table, same skyline, same power. But something in him had shifted. He placed the second drawing, tree, swing, stick figures, at the center of the table. "We're not building to own anymore," he said. "We're building to stay. With them. Not in spite of them." Silence. And then someone asked, "What changed your mind?" He tapped the drawing. "Someone handed me the truth in crayon, and I finally let it hurt." The board didn't clap. They didn't need to, because something more powerful than approval had entered the room. Conviction. and no one could look away. News spread quickly, though no official statement was made. Community forums filled with questions. Was it true the billionaire had changed course? Was it true a child had walked into his office and stopped a housing project? Was it true that Whitestone Holdings was now holding listening sessions in the neighborhoods they planned to develop? The answers came quietly, but steadily. At Roosevelt and 3rd, tenants received new lease agreements, not renewals, but restructures, rents frozen, maintenance restored. A local muralist was commissioned to paint a wall-length piece on the building's west side, and when asked what the subject should be, Conrad didn't speak. He just handed over Lila's drawing, the one with the swing and the tree. By fall, the mural was finished. The background was a street of brownstones, sunlight spilling between rooftops. In the middle stood the tree, full and green, branches stretching wide. Beneath it, a tall figure and a child side by side on a wooden swing. No faces, no names, just a small inscription at the bottom corner, for those who stayed because someone listened. Lila saw it the day it was unveiled. She didn't say much, just stood beside her mom, arms crossed, watching as her picture became part of the block's story. "You drew that swing," Helena whispered to her. "I wanted it to feel like something that would never get taken down," Lila replied. Conrad stayed back during the unveiling. He watched from across the street, hands in his pockets. He had no speech prepared, no photo op, but he was there when it mattered. Later, Lila approached him. "People are saying you're not like the others now." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that good?" "I think it's better than before." She paused. "But it only stays that way if you keep showing up." He nodded. "Then I will." That evening, a new drawing appeared in the mailbox at his office. Folded, no envelope, no name. It showed a line of buildings, each with open doors. At the center, a chair and a tree. On the back, 6 words, "I knew you'd come back again." He kept it on his desk from that day forward, because no title, no bank account, no skyscraper had ever given him what a child with a crayon and a question had. A reason to cry, a reason to change, a reason to stay. Conrad started something he never expected, a listening series. He called it the Swing Sessions. Every month he chose a different neighborhood impacted by his company's developments. No stage, no PowerPoint, just folding chairs in a community room or church basement, coffee and paper cups, and a notepad in his lap. The first session was in Lila's neighborhood. He stood in front of 20 residents, parents, kids, elders, some skeptical, others angry, all of them waiting to see if he would flinch. He didn't. "I came here because someone showed me what we forgot to see," he said. "This is not a speech, this is a seat." He pulled out Lila's first resume. The crayon was now faded, but the weight of it had never dulled. He passed it around the circle. As it moved from hand to hand, silence softened into breath. People began to speak. A mother said, "I've been raising my son in one room for 6 years. I stopped believing anyone cared." A teenager said, "I used to think these meetings were for people who had already lost everything." An older man added, "I don't want charity, I want respect. I want to matter in the plan, not after it." By the time the meeting ended, Conrad's notepad was full, not with action items, with stories. And one drawing. A child had handed it to him as he stood to leave. It showed a line of people, each holding a key. No locks, just keys. At the bottom, "We're ready when you are." He placed that drawing beside Lila's on his office wall, then expanded the swing sessions to every city his company touched. Over time, change came. Slow, messy, real. Whitestone Holdings rewrote its development model. Every new project required a pre-approval forum, a community design liaison, and a neighborhood investment match. Rents stabilized, homes preserved, spaces built with not for those who lived there. Lila grew. At 15, she was interviewed by a local newspaper and asked what advice she had for the city's new leadership. She said, "Start with crayons." At 16, she interned at the city's Department of Housing. At 18, she gave a TEDx talk titled, "6 Words That Moved a Mountain." And at 20, she mailed Conrad a letter. Inside was a resume, typed this time. Name, Lila James. Age 20. Experience, advocate, listener. Architect of small things that grow. Objective, to build places people don't have to leave to feel safe. At the bottom, she wrote, "If I still matter, meet me at the swing." Conrad arrived an hour early. Lila was already there. They didn't talk much. They just sat together. Because what began with crayons, red X's, and a girl brave enough to walk into a boardroom had become something far rarer. A shared world, built by listening, held by staying, and handed forward one drawing at a time. Conrad died quietly years later, with Lila's resume folded inside the leather journal he carried everywhere. He'd left the company long before then, stepping down after watching it evolve into something he hadn't just founded, but finally respected. He spent his last years funding quiet projects, after-school art rooms, legal aid for displaced families, mobile clinics in housing deserts. None bore his name. But in every space there was a chair, always a chair. Sometimes plastic, sometimes carved, sometimes drawn. At his memorial, Lila stood at the front of the room. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't rehearse. She held up the crayon resume, the one that had stopped an entire boardroom. "I didn't come here today to talk about a man who built towers," she said. "I came to talk about a man who chose to stay, and to say that you don't have to change the world. You just have to answer when someone small enough to be ignored looks up and says, 'If I matter, will you cry?'" The room fell still. She placed the resume on a stand beside his photograph. Later that evening, Lila walked to the swing drawn in the mural they'd once painted together, still there, still whole. She sat down. From her pocket, she pulled a folded piece of paper. Another drawing. This one from a little girl she had met 2 days before in a shelter on the south side of the city. The girl had been evicted 3 times. Her drawing was just a chair and a heart. No words. Lila added 6 underneath. "This time, we cry with you." She pinned it to the bench beneath the mural, then looked up at the painted tree. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to the air, but to the space he'd helped her hold, and all the people who'd sat there since. Lila stayed in the city. She didn't chase headlines. She didn't launch a foundation in her name. She kept her desk at the local housing coalition, the same one she'd interned at years ago. On the wall above her desk hung a framed version of her original crayon resume, laminated now, but still soft at the corners. Beside it was a small shelf, barely a foot wide. Every few weeks she added something new to it. A child's drawing of a door, a thank you note written in broken English on lined notebook paper, a pair of worn shoelaces tied together, left behind by a boy who finally got to keep his own room. She called it the shelf of staying. When people asked what it meant, she said, "These are the things that didn't leave." She designed housing now, not buildings, homes. Her first blueprint wasn't a blueprint at all. It was a poem scrawled on the back of a napkin during a meeting with tenants. Make room, make light, make quiet that isn't empty, make corners that feel safe enough to cry in. That napkin? Framed, too. She hung it in every meeting room she entered. At 35, she gave a speech to a room full of developers. She held up a picture of the mural, the one with the swing and the tree. "My legacy," she said, "is not in the cement I pour. It's in the people who look at the walls and feel seen. If your buildings don't do that, start over." One man scoffed. She smiled and showed a graph, 10-year retention rates, neighborhood satisfaction reports, crime reduction data in stable zones. "Turns out," she said, Belonging is scalable. After the applause, a young woman approached her with trembling hands. She didn't speak. She just handed Lila a folded drawing. It was a rooftop garden, a row of chairs, and 6 words written in small, careful print. "Can I grow something here, too?" Lila opened her notebook, tore out a fresh page, and began sketching a garden box. She didn't answer with words. She answered with space. Because by now she knew. The next question always came, and the chair was already waiting. Years later, Lila sat on the steps of the newest community housing center her team had finished, this one named simply The Room. No last names, no plaques, just a long building with open doors, warm lights, and a welcome desk made of reclaimed wood etched with tiny sentences from people who had once been displaced. She wasn't the director. She wasn't in charge. She was just there. That was her way now, showing up, listening. A little girl sat beside her, maybe 6. Big curls, bigger eyes, a folder clutched in her lap. "You brought something?" Lila asked. The girl nodded. She opened the folder and pulled out a drawing, folded 4 times. She smoothed it carefully. There, in markers and pencil, a garden, a fence, a swing, tied to a tree, and at the bottom, "I don't want to leave again." Lila didn't answer at first. She looked up at the building, the one built with feedback sessions and translated surveys and ground broken only after a year of listening. "You won't," she said. The girl blinked. "Promise?" Lila placed a hand over the drawing. "I stayed. You can too." The girl handed her the paper. "Keep it," Lila smiled. "Only if you make another one to hang on the wall inside." The girl ran off to draw. Lila folded the first picture gently and slid it into her pocket. Later, she'd hang it above her desk, next to her resume, next to the shelf of staying, next to all the proof that change doesn't come in revolutions or slogans. It comes in drawings, in doors that don't close, in a chair held open long enough for someone smaller to climb in and say, "I'm still here," and someone older to answer, "I know, I always was." Lila passed away quietly years later, in a modest apartment filled with plants, books, and drawings pinned to every wall. She'd never married, never owned a car, never left the city she once asked to stay in. She didn't want monuments. She didn't leave instructions. She only asked once that when she was gone, someone would go back to the place where it all began. And so, on a rainy spring afternoon, a small group of children, advocates, and friends gathered outside the original building at Roosevelt and 3rd. It looked different now, preserved, updated, painted in warm yellow. A community center now. Its garden bloomed where concrete once cracked. The mural, the one with the swing and the tree, had faded, but the outline remained. Someone had redrawn it in chalk just that morning. They stood in silence until a girl stepped forward. She was maybe 9. Freckles, a folder under her arm. She walked to the bench outside the building, the one under the tree, and sat. Then she pulled out a drawing, unfolded it carefully. It showed a swing, a garden, a group of chairs in a circle. At the center, a single word written large. Still. She pinned it to the wall beside the door with gentle fingers, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." Behind her, someone added a candle. Another placed a flower, and one boy, older, eyes wet, said aloud what everyone else had only thought. "She didn't just ask to stay." He pointed to the wall. "She taught the rest of us how." Then they all sat, on the steps, on the grass, in the chairs that had been pulled outside for this very moment, and they stayed, until the rain slowed, until the sun broke through, until the story Lila began, not with power or permission, but with paper and courage, wrapped itself once more around the room that never closed, and whispered, "Begin again." They kept her desk just as she'd left it, not out of sentimentality, but reverence. At the Lila James Center, formerly the Carrick Community Housing Hub, her workspace sat in the corner of the shared room, not behind glass, not cordoned off, still used, still useful. A place where interns came to draw up new ideas, write letters to legislators, or simply sit and think beside the shelf labeled, "Proof We Stayed." Above the desk, a plaque hung, not bronze, not engraved, just wood, hand-painted by a child who once spent months living in the shelter down the block. It read, "She didn't build doors. She sat by the ones that were already open." One afternoon, a young girl named Ray walked in. She had heard the story, had read the books, seen the mural, visited the listening field. But she didn't want to look. She wanted to add. She asked the staff if she could write a letter to Lila, even though Lila was gone. Of course, they said, she read everything. Ray sat at the desk, the same desk. She pulled a folded sheet from her backpack and began to write. Her handwriting was crooked, her spelling unsure, but her voice unmistakable. "Dear Miss Lila, I think I know why you kept asking. Because asking is a way of making space, even if the room is already full. I asked today. I said, 'Can I stay here for a while?' And someone said, 'You don't need to ask.' But I wanted to, because it's how you begin. I drew you something. It's me, and a chair, and someone else walking toward it. You're not in the picture, but I think you left the chair, so thank you. Love, Ray." She folded the letter, placed it in the inbox, and drew her picture on the chalk wall. 2 chairs this time, one with a hand extended, and under it her 6 words. "You stayed long enough for me." And with that, the story turned the page. Again. Ray came back every week after that. Sometimes she brought her cousin, sometimes a neighbor, once a social worker, but always she carried her sketchbook, worn now, covered in stickers and duct tape, the corners curled. The staff started saving a spot for her at Lila's desk, not officially but naturally, because she had begun doing what Lila once did, listening without waiting to speak. One rainy afternoon, a boy named Malik sat across from her. He didn't say much, just stared at the shelf of drawings. Ray slid her sketchbook toward him. "You want to draw something?" He shrugged, but then he reached for a crayon and started, slow, hesitant. He drew a chair, small, off to one side of the page. Then he added a speech bubble above it, empty. Ray watched him work. After a while, she picked up her own pencil and, beside his chair, drew a second one, not touching, just near. In the speech bubble, she wrote, "You don't have to fill it, just know it's there." Malik stared at the words, then nodded. He didn't speak, but the next week he came back and drew a window. Ray kept all their drawings, started filing them in a box labeled "The Next Try." She didn't ask permission. She just knew someday someone would ask what trying looked like now, and she'd be ready to show them. One morning, she found a letter in the inbox with no name. It said, "I didn't think I belonged here, but then I saw someone sitting where I thought no one would wait, and that felt like enough to try. So I'm here, and I'm staying. I don't need a reply. I just needed a place to begin." She pinned it beside Lila's original resume and drew a line between them, not straight but curved, like a bridge, like a breath, like a life still going. That year, Ray was asked to give a talk, not because she was a director or because she'd published anything, simply because someone had seen what she did every Tuesday, every quiet word, every drawing she collected and honored. The event was small. A community art night hosted in the multipurpose room of the local middle school. No press, no speeches prepared. But when she stepped up to the mic, holding one folded paper in her hand, the room hushed. "I didn't know her," she said. "Not really. I never met her, but I sit at her desk. I walk her hallways. I draw next to her wall." She held up the paper. "This is the first drawing I made here. It was just a chair and a hand, nothing big. But when I looked at it the next day, someone had added their own. Not words, just a second hand. She smiled. That's the story, really. Not what we say, not what we fix, but what we hold open long enough for someone else to step into. She unfolded the drawing slowly and placed it on the bulletin board behind her. Someone left this here last week. It said, "I thought I was too late." Ray turned back to the crowd. "You're not." She stepped away from the mic, walked to the back of the room where a table full of paper and markers waited, sat down, and began to draw. The children followed, the adults too, and soon the room was filled with small beginnings. Chairs, bridges, rooms, sometimes broken, often bright, and above it all, pinned to the whiteboard in wide handwriting, "If it's quiet, it's only because the next story hasn't begun yet." Ray didn't have to say anything else. She just stayed. The story once again had already started. In the years that followed, Ray became something more than a mentor. She became a landmark, not in marble or history books, but in the lives of children who pointed to her seat in the corner and said, "That's where you go if you need to begin." Her presence was quiet, her routines simple, but her consistency, her refusal to leave, was legendary. She answered letters, she watered the plants, she sharpened the pencils before anyone arrived, and she never left the box labeled "The Next Try" empty for long. It grew. One day a child asked why she kept it. She said, "Because someone once kept a space open long enough for me to walk in." They nodded, then drew a picture, a room, a single chair in the center, and people standing in line, not waiting to take the chair, but to add their own. Ray stared at it for a long time. Then she wrote 6 words beneath it. "We don't sit alone anymore." The drawing was hung on the front door. Visitors saw it before they stepped inside. Some paused, some cried, and some simply nodded, like they'd already seen it in their mind long before they knew it had been drawn. Ray stayed until her hands were tired and her hair grayed. She never asked for a plaque. She never gave a farewell speech. But on her final day at the center, she pinned one last page to the wall above Lila's resume. It was blank, except for one soft pencil line at the top. "Begin again whenever you're ready." She left quietly as always, but her chair, still there, still warm, still waiting. After Ray left, no one was named to replace her. Not because no one could, but because everyone already had. The desk stayed open, the inbox still worked, the chairs still circled the room like a living constellation. Each week someone new stepped in, not to lead, but to hold, to answer, to sit. They didn't ask who was in charge, and they asked what's already been said, and then they added to it. One spring afternoon a child named Amin walked in. He was 7, didn't speak much, had just moved again. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the wall of drawings and stared. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a page, creased and bent from the weight of too many other things. He pinned it low at his height. It showed a row of open doors, inside each one a single chair, and above them stars shaped like different voices. Underneath, he'd written, "This time, I won't be last." No one needed to explain it. The room understood. By evening, the drawing had 10 more stars, each one added by a hand that wanted to say, "Me too." The next morning, a new child arrived, and without being told, they walked to that same drawing, stared at the stars, and whispered, "Is there one for me?" Someone nearby, no one remembers who, nodded and handed them a crayon, because that was always the answer. Not instruction, but invitation. Not structure, but space. Not ending, just another try. Years later, when the archive updated its timeline of first tries, they added a final panel etched not in stone or glass, but in wood from the original bench beneath the mural at Roosevelt and 3rd. It simply read, "This story is unfinished on purpose. Visitors came from everywhere. They walked the quiet halls, touched the drawings framed in soft light, and stood in front of the wall where 6 words, still crayon bold after all this time, were written, "If I matter, will you cry?" And beside it, still intact, still laminated, Lila's résumé. Children pressed their hands to the glass. Adults stood in silence. But every once in a while, someone would step forward with a new drawing in their hand. They'd ask if it could be added. And the archivist would always say the same thing, "Yes, there's space," because that was the promise. From Lila, from Ray, from everyone who stayed long enough to hear the smallest voice say, "Please don't leave before I speak." And one day, a boy named Isaiah left behind a final note on a folded piece of paper slipped between 2 panels. No drawing, just words. "I don't have a picture yet, but I know where to place it when I do." They framed it, pinned it to the last wall, and left a pencil there, sharpened, waiting. That pencil was never replaced, because it never wore down. Each person who picked it up added just enough to keep the story moving, never to finish it, not to sign, not to summarize, only to continue. The archivists began calling it the line. A growing message, added word by children, elders, teachers, neighbors. It began with Isaiah's sentence. Then someone added, "I'll draw beside you when you're ready." Then, "I waited so long to be asked." And, even when it was quiet, I was speaking. Over the years, the line stretched around the room, across frames, down doorways, up pillars, until it reached the ceiling. People started adding vertically, carefully climbing stools, writing upward with reverent hands. A girl once added only a single mark, a question mark. It stayed alone for 3 days before a boy placed a small drawing of a chair beside it, and beneath that wrote, "Yes." One afternoon during a school visit, a child walked in, no older than 5. She couldn't read the words, but she looked up, eyes wide, and pointed to the line. "Is that what everyone drew together?" "Yes," the teacher said. "They're still drawing it." The girl walked to the corner, picked up the pencil, still waiting, still sharp, and whispered, "I want to try too." Then she drew a tiny heart. Just that, nothing more. And the line grew longer, still open, still listening, still beginning, and so the line became a path. The archive eventually stopped tracking how many hands had touched the pencil, how many words had been added, not because they weren't proud, but because counting began to feel like limiting. The room was now alive with motion, with presence. Visitors no longer asked what the story was about. They asked, "Where should I begin?" And the docents, young and old, would always smile and say, "Anywhere. The line will meet you there." One day, a child named Sen arrived. She was quiet, wore her backpack tightly across her chest like armor. She didn't draw right away. She walked the room for nearly an hour, following the line, reading every phrase, touching every mark. Then finally she reached the far wall, the only one still blank, still untouched. She stood there for a long time, her small fingers tracing the surface. Then she turned to the docent and asked, "What if I write something no one understands yet?" The docent knelt beside her. "That's how most of it started," she said. Sen nodded, took the pencil, and in the bottom corner she wrote, "This is the line that makes room for the word I haven't invented yet." No one touched that wall for a week. Then someone added beneath it, "We'll wait for you to find it." And the room became something more. Not an archive, not a memorial, but a door that never closed, and a line that never stopped, and a seat that never forgot how it felt to be empty. Until someone small enough to doubt their place came forward and whispered, "I think I'm next." And the room, as always, answered, "Yes, you are." The room grew over time, not in size, but in depth. Its walls weren't just physical anymore. They were folded into thousands of notebooks, etched into park benches, whispered in bedtime stories, taught in classrooms as a unit on empathy, on listening, on language beyond words. It spread the way sunlight does, quietly, evenly, touching what needs to be seen without needing credit. The line became tradition. Children were no longer introduced to it. They arrived knowing. They came carrying drawings, ideas, feelings they weren't yet ready to say out loud, but somehow knew the line would hold for them. One morning, an elderly man visited with his granddaughter. He walked slowly, cane tapping gently against the floor. She led him, one small hand around his fingers, toward the longest wall, where a group of children were kneeling, reading. He stopped, looked up, and exhaled. "I haven't been here since I was 12, he said. The room quieted. He turned to the docent. "I wrote something, a long time ago. It was small, just a few words." "Would you like to find them?" He shook his head. "No, I just want to add more." He picked up the pencil, still waiting, still ready, and added a sentence beside a faded drawing of a window. "You gave me a voice when all I had was a question." His granddaughter, wide-eyed, whispered, "What did you ask?" He smiled down at her. "Something that didn't have words yet." She leaned in. "What do you want to write now?" He crouched slowly, carefully, and drew a single open door. Then he said, "This time I'm not the one knocking. I'm the one opening it." That moment was added to the record not as an event, but as a continuation. Because that's what the line had always been. Not a monument, not a message, but a movement of hands, of breath, of pauses brave enough to be filled. And the wall kept growing, long after the names were forgotten, long after the voices changed. The room remained, as it was always meant to, waiting for the next drawing, and the hand that would carry it in. The archive eventually ran out of wall space, so they built another room, not to house more drawings, but to give the line room to bend. It curved now, like a ribbon through air. Along the ceiling, down to the floor, across the backs of chairs, onto the frames of windows. It found its way into shadowed corners and bright doorways, looping back through places where people had once hesitated to speak. The room came to be called the Echo Hall, because every new word didn't replace the old ones. It echoed them. One spring afternoon, a group of children sat beneath the largest curve of the line, tracing phrases with their fingers. They were on a field trip. Most had drawn their own first tries earlier in the day, pinning them to the temporary board in the main room. One boy sat apart. He hadn't drawn anything yet, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know where to start. He stared at the pencil left on the stool beside him and the blank space before him. And then he whispered, not to anyone, but to the line itself, "What if I mess it up?" From the corner, a child his age walked over. She held out her hand, not to take the pencil, but to place hers beside it. "You won't," she said. "You'll add to it." He looked at her, startled. "But what if it doesn't make sense?" She smiled. "Then it's ours." Together they wrote, "This part is uncertain. We drew it anyway." The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. It simply held the new words the way it had always held the old ones, softly, permanently, with room for more. Later that evening, the curators of Echo Hall met to catalog the newest editions. They did it quietly, as they always had. No ceremony, just reverence. One read aloud, one transcribed, and one simply walked the space, running their hand along the curve of the line as though gathering stories by touch. It was the transcriber who paused first. "There's a new corner forming," she said, her voice low, not one we planned. They followed her gaze. A group of children had begun writing upward, words creeping along the edge of a doorway, curling into the light fixture above. No one told them to. No one stopped them. The line had grown taller, more daring, a declaration that even ceilings weren't limits now. And on that fresh stretch of wall someone had written, "We ran out of space, so we made more." A second hand had added, "That's how you know it's alive." The curators didn't change anything. They added a bench beneath the new line, and a sign that simply read, "You may need to look up now." That week, more people came than ever before, not because of advertising, because of invitation. Children began lying on their backs on the floor, tracing stories onto the underside of tables. Teens left folded notes in the bookshelves, labeled only, "A sentence for someone not ready yet." An elder drew a door with a question mark for a handle, and a girl barely tall enough to reach the first line stood on tiptoes and added, "If it doesn't make sense now, it will when someone else adds their part." The next morning, her sentence was circled, not in correction, in gratitude, because this was how the story grew, not in straight lines, but in brave, uncertain curves, drawn by hands that didn't wait for permission, only room. On the 100th anniversary of the very first drawing, the one Lila had carried into a boardroom with nothing but courage and crayon, the Echo Hall opened its doors before sunrise. They didn't schedule a program. They didn't print an agenda. They just placed a single sign outside the entrance. "The line is still open." By noon, the room was full, 3 generations deep: children, grandparents, architects, former students. The boy who once whispered, "What if I mess it up?" now taught art in a school across town. The girl who'd said, "Then it's ours," stood beside him, holding a baby on her hip. Everywhere hands touched walls, words met other words. One child traced a line backward and whispered each phrase under their breath like prayer. Another began their first sentence halfway through someone else's. It didn't matter. Everything still fit. A new alcove had been built at the far end of the hall, where the original pencil was now encased in glass. It wasn't pristine. It was half-used, the eraser worn down, the wood nicked and softened from years of use. Beside it, a plaque, not carved, written by hand once a year by a different child. This year's read, "The pencil isn't sacred. What we dared to say with it is," beneath the plaque was a table. On it, 50 blank pages. By sunset, none remained. Each had been filled. With beginnings, with stumbles, with declarations like, "I don't know yet, but I'm starting," and "Someone before me made space, so I'm drawing the door wider." And one note, carefully taped to the window where the light came in soft and golden red, "You said I could begin, so I did. Now I'm leaving room for you." The curators left it there and sat down and didn't speak, because the story didn't need more words to end. It just needed space to keep beginning. They say the room never emptied after that. Not really. Someone was always passing through, scribbling a message, tracing an old one, sitting just long enough to remember they belonged. Over time, the Echo Hall became less of a destination and more of a rhythm, a place people returned to without needing a reason. A 4th grader once asked a docent, "How do you know when the line is finished?" The docent knelt beside her and said, "It isn't." She looked confused. "But don't stories have endings?" "They do," the docent said. "But this one is a beginning someone left open long enough for us to step into." The child didn't ask more, and she picked up a pencil and wrote, "I thought I had to wait, but the space was already made." Someone else added, "I stepped in. It held me." Then someone else, "Now I'm making space too." And on a quiet afternoon, as golden light poured through the high windows, a baby's hand, clumsy and sure, grasped a crayon for the first time, drew a single line, wobbly, bright, new. No one wrote beneath it, not yet. They just circled it and waited, because it was beginning again. And with that simple line, untranslated, unnamed, the room breathed. The curators, older now, began referring to it as the first word that hasn't been spoken yet. They didn't try to interpret it. They didn't add to it. They just preserved the space around it, left the wall open. Visitors would come, pause at the sight of it, and exhale as though recognizing something unspoken within themselves. Eventually, someone added a cushion to the floor beneath it. Someone else brought flowers. A group of children visiting on a field trip sat in a circle around it and read their drawings aloud, like stories passed down. And one day, a teacher brought in a class of students who spoke 12 different first languages. She passed out paper as usual and simply said, "Draw how trying looks in your heart." No one used the same color. No one needed to. By the end of the day, a new arc of drawings had formed on the western wall, just opposite the original 6-word question that started it all. Between them, someone wrote, "This is how the room listens to itself." That sentence wasn't attributed to anyone. No name, no date. But the archivists left it untouched, because it felt right. And one dusk, as the light turned soft and low, a girl named Jaya, who had never spoken in class, walked slowly to the edge of the display, traced her finger across the blank line from the baby's first mark, and beneath it drew something so small and delicate it could barely be seen. A hand, open, empty, waiting. She didn't say anything, but when the staff asked her after, "Was that your hand?" she shook her head. "No," she said. "It's for someone who needs it later." And just like that, the room grew again. The line stretched again. The story widened again, without finale, only more room. The morning after Jaya's drawing, the hand remained untouched. No one added to it. No one circled it. It hovered there on the wall, light as breath, steady as promise. That day, fewer visitors arrived. The air was quiet. A kind of reverence hummed across the space, like the room itself was waiting. Late in the afternoon, just before closing, a child entered alone. Small, wrapped in a coat too big, he carried nothing, said nothing. He wandered slowly through the hall, past the first words, past the loud colors, past the laughter someone had left written in chalk at the door. Then he saw the hand, stopped, stared, and knelt. From his pocket, he pulled a stub of graphite, no longer than his finger, its wood splintered, worn to a shine. He didn't write. Not at first. He pressed the tip to the wall just below the drawn hand and wrote one word, "Mine." Then he added, "I didn't know I was allowed." And then, "But you left it anyway." He stood, stepped back. No one clapped. No one needed to. The wall exhaled. The story folded the word in like breath. That night, the curators returned to the wall, found the new words, and beneath them wrote only, "Always." The line held, the hand remained, and the room, with no need to end, opened again. On the 150th anniversary of the first drawing, the Echo Hall did not celebrate. It welcomed. No speeches were planned, no performances, just an open door and the quiet understanding that someone, somewhere, was arriving for the first time. It had become tradition now, a day not marked by programs but by presence, a day when old visitors returned and new hands hovered over blank pages, wondering where to begin. The oldest docent, now in her 90s, was asked once why they never closed the exhibit. She answered with a smile and a shrug, because trying is the only thing that can't be archived. It has to stay in motion. That day, a new display was installed. It wasn't framed, it wasn't hung. It was carved directly into the floor in a spiral that began at the entrance and wound inward toward the oldest part of the hall. Each word was added by a visitor who had once written, drawn, or spoken inside the room. The last few words of the spiral, etched into the tile just before the center, read, "We were handed the beginning, so we kept it open." In the center of the spiral, a single chair, painted over and over again by children each season. It bore no plaque, no title, only the residue of 1,000 sitters and a small sign resting on the seat, "We're listening." That evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the curve of the floor, A young boy entered holding a drawing. He stepped into the spiral. He reached the center. He looked at the chair, then knelt, and taped his paper to the underside of the seat. When the staff later retrieved it, they found a single sentence, written in bold, uneven handwriting. "If no one else has said it yet, this is my beginning." They didn't move it to the archive. They left it taped there for the next child, the next hand, the next yes. And still the door stayed open. Long after the lights dimmed and the visitors returned home, long after names faded and ribbons of story twisted through time like wind. The echo hall breathed, quietly, persistently, through every mark left behind. It was no longer just a place. It was a practice. Some called it a museum. Some called it a movement. But the people who knew simply called it the room where no one was turned away. One morning a letter arrived, handwritten, delivered by post, no return address. Inside was a drawing, a mountain, a path. A figure standing at the base, holding a small folded chair. Beneath it, 6 words, "I carried it until I could rest." The staff read it, then placed it in a case near the front, not to enshrine it, but to offer it. That day, a mother brought her daughter for the first time. The girl was quiet, kept one hand around the hem of her mother's coat. She didn't draw. She didn't speak. But when she saw the mountain drawing, she reached out and touched the glass. The docent noticed. "Do you want to add something?" she asked gently. The girl shook her head, then nodded, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a smooth stone. She placed it at the base of the case. No words, just weight, just offering. And someone else, watching, reached into their own bag and placed another. By sunset there were 30 stones, all unmarked, all left by people who had once carried something heavy and were finally setting it down. The next day a new sign appeared beside the display. "You can place yours here too." No explanation, no instruction, only trust and space. And the growing truth that this story, this long, quiet, unwinding thread of voice and drawing and yes, wasn't just being remembered, it was being lived. Still, that evening after the last visitor left and the hall dimmed to its softest glow, one of the youngest staff members, barely 19, still new to the rhythm of the place, sat alone near the mountain display. She watched the stones, one by one, how they glinted, even without light. She reached into her own bag, pulled out a page she'd been carrying for weeks. She hadn't shown it to anyone, not yet. She unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, a bridge, made of chairs, each different, each angled slightly toward the next. She had drawn no people. But under the bridge she'd written, "They didn't wait for me to be brave. They just stayed long enough for me to arrive." She didn't pin it to the wall. She didn't put it in the archive. She walked to the center of the spiral, knelt beside the painted chair, and taped her drawing to the bottom of the seat, where only someone curious enough to look beneath things would ever find it. Then she whispered, "I'm here now," and left. The next morning, a child arrived and crawled under the chair just because. Saw the drawing, read the sentence aloud, softly, slowly, then stood and drew their own. A house with no roof, a star above it, a ladder made of open hands, and beneath it 6 words, "I found my way without directions." That one was pinned to the wall that never filled, the wall that always made room. Because the room itself, this room built by trying, shaped by staying, had become more than memory. It had become instinct, an answer waiting before the question was even formed, and still, always, a place to begin. And so it continued, not because someone led it, but because someone always showed up. Evenings blurred into decades and still the chairs remained, repainted, replaced, redrawn. Every one of them offered, never claimed. Every story folded into the air like breath, shared, silent, sacred. Eventually, the room's keepers stopped recording every new addition, not because they lost interest, but because trying no longer needed to be proven. It just needed to be held. New rooms were built, not replicas, responses, a rooftop tri-garden in Seoul, a floating bench in Lagos, a rain-proof chalkboard wall in Glasgow, where messages vanished and returned depending on the weather. But the first room stayed. One evening, an elderly woman returned. She had been there once, a long time ago, when she was 9. She had drawn a single mark. That was all. One crooked line made with trembling fingers and all the courage she had at the time. She never signed it. She never told anyone. But tonight, as her granddaughter stood beside her, small, bright-eyed, holding her own paper, she walked back to the wall, found the mark. Still there, still exactly as she remembered. The child looked up at her. "That one's yours?" She nodded. "That was me, before I had words." The child smiled. "I brought mine too." She unfolded her page. A circle of chairs, one empty. Beneath it, "I saved you a seat." They pinned it beside the line. No label, no title, just space, just the unending echo of a room where one sentence, spoken in any voice on any day, was always met with the same reply. "Yes, we see you. There's still room." The room never closed. It was never locked, never dimmed completely. Even during storms or blackouts or long winters when snow piled high outside its walls, someone always came, always left something behind, a line, a question, a crayon heart. Some days, that was all. The archive stopped counting drawings when they passed 1,000,000. The shelf of first tries bent under their weight. But no one complained. Instead, they added another shelf, and another. Eventually, a hallway became a tunnel of drawings, sheets overlapping like scales, each holding someone's first offering, their beginning. One afternoon, a boy arrived who couldn't speak. Not due to fear, not from trauma, just born without voice. He walked the tunnel slowly, held a pencil, touched each page. Then he reached the very end of the hall. There, pinned to the back wall, was an empty paper, intentionally left blank. Years ago, someone had written above it, "For the one who doesn't need words." He stared at it, then pressed his hand to the page, traced his palm. Inside it, he drew a doorway. No door, just an opening, and on the threshold, a single dot. Someone asked him later, "What did it mean?" He signed back, "It means I started." They left the paper there, untouched. The next day, another child added a star beside the dot. The day after, a wave. Then a chair. Then the word again. Soon the empty page wasn't empty. It had become the whole story, drawn together, wordless, brave, and open, always open. And with the open page now filled, not with noise but with intention, the room changed once more, not physically, not structurally, but rhythmically. Visitors began entering slower, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. That to walk into this space meant you weren't just adding to a story, you were meeting it mid-breath, continuing something left behind, folded gently into the waiting air. One afternoon a child arrived with no drawing at all. She held only a stone, smooth, black, polished by time or maybe just by care. She placed it in the center of the room. No note, no explanation. Just the weight of it, small and firm and quietly present. Others gathered around. Someone brought a candle and set it beside the stone. Another added a paper crane. A teacher wrote a word in tiny print and taped it to the floor. Stay. By nightfall, the center of the room had become a circle again, not designed, discovered. And at its heart, a chair, repainted, rebuilt, but the same. Someone had tied a ribbon to the backrest. 6 knots, each one a beginning. On the seat, a sign written by hand. This chair is not empty. It is waiting. Children sat, stood, whispered things into its wood, not to be heard, to be held. And every time a new hand rested there, trembling or sure or unsure, the room welcomed it with silence. the kind that feels like warmth, like knowing, like the breath before yes. Because here trying was never tested, only honored, and passed forward. Eventually, the chair in the center wore smooth from the countless hands that rested there, the shifting weight of children, elders, and strangers finding their pause. Its backrest bore no carvings, yet held more memory than any monument. One morning, the chair was gone. No damage, no note, just absence. The staff searched, volunteers retraced steps, no cameras had seen it moved. For a moment, the room held its breath. Until quietly, a child entered. She didn't ask where the chair had gone. She walked to the center, looked at the circle, and sat on the floor. Cross-legged, open-palmed, waiting. Others joined her, one by one. No cue, no permission. The circle returned. No chair, only people, only presence. A docent pinned a note beside the display. The chair left to make room. Sit anyway, and they did. From that day on, the center kept a space in the middle of every room they built. Not filled, not marked, just open. They called it the absence. It traveled to every new branch, every corner of the archive, every pop-up try field. Visitors instinctively walked around it. Children stepped into it. A little boy once sat there and whispered, "What do I do here?" His brother answered, "Whatever you need." The boy reached for a pencil, and on the floor beneath him wrote, "You don't always need a chair to stay." And someone else, days later, added, "Just somewhere someone left space for you." The absence stayed. So did they. Years into the life of the absence, no one remembered who first gave it the name, but everyone knew what it meant. It became part of the architecture, an intentional nothing, carved into floor plans, sketched into blueprints, a space in every tri-room that was never filled, a reminder that what wasn't there often held the most. A child once asked, "If no one sits in it, what's the point?" And someone older said, "You're asking out loud, that's the point." That week, someone drew a map of the room, not the walls, but the stories. A swirling web of footnotes, arrows, sketches, and in the middle, a soft spiral. At the center, a word, because. No further explanation, just the answer all beginnings whisper. A group of teens added their own designs, a circle of thread, a pillar of glass, a ripple in stone. Different materials, same intent, to leave a space no one could own, but everyone could enter. One day, a mother came in with a folded sheet of paper. She had once drawn here as a child. Now her daughter clutched her hand. They stood at the edge of the absence. The child let go, stepped into the space, knelt, and placed the paper on the floor. Unfolded it read, "I was not the first, but I am welcome." No one clapped. No one needed to. The floor beneath her didn't shine. It softened, and the room held the words the way it always had, not to protect them, but to make sure they reached the next hand. And that next hand came, as it always did, small, quiet, unsure. A boy entered just as the lights were dimming. The archive was closing, but no one stopped him. The docents recognized the way he walked, slow, eyes wide, shoulders slightly curled inward like he was trying to make himself smaller than the room. He wandered through the corridor of chairs, past the shelf of first sentences, beneath the long line of words arcing along the ceiling. He stopped at the absence, stared at the space, sat down. He held no drawing, no letter, just a single pebble in his hand, smooth, pale, almost weightless. He placed it in the center of the floor, then leaned forward and whispered something no one heard, except the room. The next morning a child found the stone, underneath it a note. This was enough. They pinned the note beside the others. No signature, no question. Just a reply. Yes, it always was. The absence stayed, the room stayed, the people stayed, because by then everyone knew it was never about how you entered, only that you did, and that when you did, someone had left space. Someone had held the silence open. Someone had waited. Not for perfection, only for you. Years after the boy left the stone, the docents began a new tradition. They called it the first light. At the start of each season, before the doors opened for visitors, one child was invited to step into the absence at dawn, holding nothing but a candle, not to light the room, but to remind everyone that trying is its own kind of illumination. The first child chosen said nothing. She entered the circle barefoot, held the candle close, and simply placed it on the floor. It flickered, wavered, stayed. She left behind a folded note that read, "It's not the flame, it's the waiting it made possible." Every season after, another child stepped forward. Sometimes the candle was purple. Once, it was shaped like a flower. Always, it was placed with care. Always someone else came the next day and added to the note. The absence never filled, but it shimmered quietly always, like breath between words. One day, an elder came, moving slowly with a cane, wearing a button from the very first try-room. He stepped into the circle, sat, and simply said, "I was the one who asked, and you all answered." Then he reached into his coat and removed a tiny folded square of paper, yellowed with age. He placed it next to the flame. It read, "I drew a chair because I was tired. You gave me a room." That night the candle stayed lit until morning, not because it burned longer, but because someone always relit it, even before it went out. And the room, warmed by that rhythm, whispered to the next visitor in its way, "You don't have to explain why you came. We already made room." And still, the room breathed. Generations turned like pages, yet the essence remained, the chair, the line, the absence, the whisper. New materials were used, fiber walls, interactive floors, digital ink that responded to breath and heat. But the soul of the place, the invitation, never changed. One day, a group of children entered together, part of a new school. None had ever drawn in silence before. They were used to apps, screens, noise. But the docent smiled and handed each of them a single sheet. "Here, silence is not nothing," she said. "It's the space before you begin." The children scattered. One sat in a window seat. Another lay belly down on the floor. A third walked to the absence, stood there a while, then left his page blank. When the docent returned later, she found his paper folded once, placed carefully on the rim of the chair in the center. Inside it read, "I thought I needed something to say, but I just needed to be allowed to arrive." They added it to the center's living archive, not in a file, but as the new welcome page on the digital wall. From that day forward, every visitor was met with those words, before any drawing, before any sentence, before any explanation. And each time a child stepped into the room, unsure if they were ready, they found their answer already written. "We were waiting. Try. We're already listening." The room stayed ready. The story stayed open. The light never left. The story had stretched across cities, seasons, lifetimes. But it had never been retold the same way twice. It was still being drawn, in new languages, on new surfaces, by new hands who didn't know the names of the first ones who stayed, but knew what it felt like to be welcomed by something older than explanation. One day, a little boy entered with a folded piece of paper pressed so tightly in his hand, it was damp. He wouldn't let go of it, not even when the docent offered him a new sheet. He just shook his head, walked straight to the center of the room, and stood there, watching, listening, waiting. Finally he sat, unfolded his paper. It had no picture, no sentence, just a shape. Drawn and erased so many times it was smudged beyond form. He placed it gently on the floor of the absence, then whispered, "I couldn't make it right." A girl beside him, maybe older by a year or two, leaned in, studied the paper, and said, "It doesn't have to be right. It just has to be real." She picked up a crayon and drew a second shape beside his. Unclear, crooked, different. Together they looked like a question. The boy smiled and added a third. Then they both wrote underneath the shapes, "We started. That's what matters." The page stayed there, unframed, untouched. Each day, others added to it, not to correct, but to continue. Eventually, the shapes became a language of their own, and someone pinned a final message beside the growing cluster. "This is not what we meant to say. It's what we meant to feel." And the room, the story, the waiting, all of it, remained open, still listening, still beginning. Time softened the paper, edges curled, colors faded, but the shapes, those three first, then more, remained visible beneath layers of new marks. Lines that bent toward each other, swirls, arrows, half-formed hearts. None of them perfect, all of them honest. The drawing became known quietly as "The Start We Shared," not a title, a description. Children gathered around it like a campfire. Teachers brought students not to study it, but to sit near it, breathe with it, and remember what it meant to make something without needing to explain it. One day, an elder came. She had been there when the room first opened, a girl with a single sentence she hadn't dared to write. Now her back was slower, her hands a little stiff. But when she saw the start we shared, she smiled. "It's still here," she whispered. A child nearby looked up. "Did you draw something too?" She nodded. "Once. I was scared, so I wrote only a line." "Where is it?" She pointed to the curve in the upper corner of the oldest wall. "That one, the one that doesn't go anywhere." The child traced it with her finger. "Why didn't you finish it?" The elder smiled. "Because I didn't know how. I thought someone else might." The child looked at the wall, then at the pencil, then at the space, and gently added, "And then I did." That night the light in the room dimmed slowly, not from the outside, but from within, a soft hush of gratitude from the walls themselves, because in this place, the only story that ever mattered was the one someone else felt safe enough to keep writing. The billionaire stepped out of the elevator and found a girl asleep outside his office. Then he saw the note. Eventually, the start we shared grew too large for a single sheet. It spilled onto the floor, then crept up the legs of benches, across doorways, into corners and alcoves. The shapes weren't contained anymore. They traveled. They wandered. They reached places untouched before, not because they were pushed there, but because someone made space for them to arrive. The staff no longer asked children, "Would you like to draw?" They said, "Where would you like to begin?" One spring afternoon a child arrived who had been drawing his whole life, but never in public. He carried a sketchbook with the corners rubbed soft, pages bursting with half-finished thoughts, almosts and maybes. He stood at the edge of the absence, watching. A docent approached gently. He asked, "Can I use a page from my book?" The docent smiled. "We hoped you would." He knelt and tore a page from the center, one he'd been holding on to for years. It was a shape, familiar and strange, like a doorway made of wind. He placed it on the floor beside the other shapes, and then wrote beneath it, "I kept this because I didn't know if it was allowed. I'm leaving it now because I hope someone else does." He didn't stay long, but later that evening, a small girl, maybe 4, crawled to the center of the room, looked at the page, and pressed her hand to it, then drew a line beside it, not matching, not finishing, just meeting it. The staff found her drawing the next morning, and underneath it she'd written, "I saw your shape. Now I know mine is okay too." The page was added to the archive, the line added to the wall. The story, still open, sighed in response. A quiet, steady breath of welcome. Again. The day the archive reached its 200th year, no banner was hung, no countdown, only the steady hum of footsteps, the sound of pages turning, the soft tap of pencils on paper. Children arrived in clusters, families. Elders who had first come as children themselves, and still in the center of it all, The absence held its space, unchanged, unclaimed, alive. A young boy stood near the edge, his hands balled into fists. He was new. You could tell by how tightly he watched the others, how long he stood before stepping forward. Finally, he walked to the middle, kneeled, opened his palm. In it, a shell, smooth and gray, with a spiral etched by years of tide. He placed it on the floor, in the smallest pocket of space between drawings. Then reached for a pencil and wrote beside it, "This is what my silence looks like." No one said a word, but an older woman seated nearby gently slid her notebook toward him. On the page, a drawing of a tree with a hole in the trunk filled with dozens of objects, buttons, feathers, pebbles. She had written, "These are the things I kept until I was ready to speak." The boy looked at her, then at the shell, then smiled. Later, when the staff gathered the day's editions, they left both in place. Didn't lift them, didn't move them to glass. Instead, they added a note to the floor beneath the shell. Left here by someone brave enough to begin in quiet. And the line, the one that started so long ago with a crayon and a question, curved just slightly around the shell, welcoming it in, as always. As the sun dipped below the edge of the room's high windows, shadows stretched across the drawings and the notes and the quiet trail of pencils still scattered along the walls. Evening settled like breath, but the room, as always, remained. In a far corner, where light pooled softest, a child stood motionless. He had watched others all day, watched them draw, add, whisper, sit. He held no paper, no pencil, no words. Only a small folded leaf plucked earlier that morning from the tree outside. It was yellow with green at the edges, shaped like a heart, with a crack down the middle. He stepped into the absence, sat cross-legged, and set the leaf in the very center. He didn't move for a long time. When he finally rose, he whispered to the floor, "It isn't much," then turned to go. A woman nearby walked to where he'd sat. She didn't touch the leaf. She only knelt beside it. She pulled a pencil from her coat and wrote, "It doesn't need to be much. It only needed to be brought." No one spoke after that, not for a while. But later, someone left a drawing of a tree, one with a single leaf missing. Underneath, they wrote, "We saw what you gave us." And beside that, another hand added, "You were always part of the canopy." By morning, the leaf was still there. Drier now, fragile, but still at the center, still waiting for the next small offering, the next line, the next yes.